in this moment, having those things being disconnected and disjointed from one another has made our communities extremely not resilient to, whether they be to the impacts of climate change, or in this case, a global pandemic. And so, I keep saying, we don't want to go back to we don't want to go back to, pre-COVID or normal, because what that meant was extreme injustices for so many people, including Indigenous people. And so when I think about radically imagining what the future, can look like, is, we talk about things like the democratization of energy, getting, our energy systems more localized, getting those energy systems democratized, having energy systems like renewable energy that are helping build up economies, instead of expediting climate change and the impacts of climate change on communities and people. I think the facts are proven. You improve and build local and regional food systems, it creates more jobs in those regional and local economies. It creates healthier food. It has less of an impact on the environment. This is a time where we can pivot to expediting solutions like that, and looking at getting away from this idea of just pure corporate power into this concept and idea of beginning to build community wealth and building community-owned enterprises and models of building community wealth. And so that's what, when I'm thinking about how we're radically imagining the future that we want to live in, I think that education is going to be looked at differently. I mean, we value academic rigor this much, and we don't value people's, hands in the soil, and their ability to grow food, provide for their people, provide for their families. And so I think that there's a lot of sort of reimagining and pivoting. But if we don't consciously pivot, and we don't consciously create solutions and shift resources into those solutions, we're just going to say, oh, hey, remember that pandemic of 2020? Yeah, I remember that. Yet nothing has changed since then.
Right. And Nick, in many ways, I mean, what you've been working on for over a decade on Pine Ridge and beyond is to create a new normal, right? This was pre-pandemic, that challenges our economic system, our fossil fuel dominated energy system, the chronic underinvestment in Indigenous people. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, this is bringing into sharper focus, it seems like, the need, right? And people's willingness to entertain this kind of this reset, so to speak. But this is not day one for you. You guys are already mid-stride in demonstrating what some of this looks like, at least again on Pine Ridge and increasingly beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had, definitely the deep honor to do a lot of work on Pine Ridge, but also there's like movements, like the movement for food sovereignty all throughout Indian country and throughout Indigenous communities is ripe. Like, it is happening in dozens of communities. There is massive movements to protect, the air, land, water, and rights of communities. There's massive movements in which Indigenous people are centered in the environmental justice movement. There's massive movements in, sustainable and regenerative community development that are often led by Indigenous people. And movements to revitalize like our languages, ceremonies, and lifeways that are so much the foundation and inform our values of not only let's do those things, but how we do those things. And so yeah, I mean, I think that there's this massive, ripe movement that has been existing for quite some time, growing and growing, over the past 15 years or so in Indian country. And it was one of the reasons why we created Indian Collective, was because we knew there was a movement here. We knew that there was this powerful Indigenous people, not just coming from my community, but coming from communities all throughout Indian country. But that we had to change the conditions in which those leaders in those communities were supported, because of systemic racism and because of the lack of a visibility of Native people, we have been extremely underinvested. Less than 0.5% of all philanthropy in America goes to Native people. If you minus Indian gaming and you minus extractive industries, there's almost no investment happening to Native people. So that's why you're not seeing job creation. And so Indian Collective has been, an organization who's really movement infrastructure. I don't even say that we're an intermediary organization, because I think that intermediaries in some ways are white supremacist constructs that just get repeated, as opposed to saying we're building movement infrastructure by informed our people with our people with lived experience in doing this work, to move resources in different ways, to make sure that we can truly invest into the self-determination of Indigenous people, to build up economies and to build the new economy that we're all working for.
And tell us a little more about that infrastructure, because we're here with Catalyst 2030, and so when you think about that word catalyze, in a lot of ways, right, your own journey was from someone who was focused at a very local level there on Pine Ridge, and founding Thunder Valley, a community development corporation, which is one of the early ones doing what you're doing there. And there's a very robust and fascinating physical development project. But you, in a way, then now you've graduated to this more meta level of saying, look, what we need is many more people like the 10 years ago, the 15 years ago, Nick Tilson. There need to be more avenues of support for Indigenous leaders to actually grow and scale this kind of work, right? It's not a shortage of good ideas. It's a shortage of resources, a shortage of opportunities to connect so that these ideas can flow in and out. And you're now providing that catalytic kind of network.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's the idea. So and we had this, the idea was, even the work that I was doing at Thunder Valley, the whole concept was that the solutions exist in the spirit of the people and the genius of the place already. They exist there. How do you resource the leaders and the people who are the genius of that place, who are the spirit of that place, to radically have the resources that they need to radically imagine the future and to invest into that future? And so NDN, we looked at the macro level. One of the, as proud as I was of the work that was happening at Thunder Valley and how much that helped, what I didn't like was that it was becoming the exception, right? And I think that the world of philanthropy and sort of investment, they like these exceptional human interest stories, right? There's this person and they're doing this amazing thing, and there's this. And so as I was building Thunder Valley and our story got lifted up, we were getting calls from, over 70 different tribal nations, across North America, who were saying, we want to do something similar to what you're doing there, but within the context of our own culture, spirit of place. And so that's why then I looked at the statistics, right? Of, I thought I was just making headway on a local place-based, community level, but recognizing there was almost no movement happening when it came to investment to other communities and other places. There was no increase of that. And, one of the big conclusions that I came to was that white supremacy is alive and well in the field of philanthropy. And white supremacist constructs exist and alive and well in the field of philanthropy. And one of our greatest poets, John Trudell, used to say in his poem, he had a poem and a saying that said, the reason why Americans, want to have, don't want to acknowledge Indigenous people is because we're evidence of the crime. And so there's some of that is absolutely entrenched in the active, consistent erasure of Indigenous people. And so we wanted to build new infrastructure that was by and for Indigenous people. And so we're in the process of building the biggest philanthropic fund in the history of philanthropy, led by Indigenous people. And so our goal is to build a $50 million annual grant-making fund that gives six-figure grant-making dollars to Indigenous-led and self-determination efforts throughout Turtle Island. And some people say, well, how come you decided $50 million and what's that? Well, the truth is our people need much more resources than that. There's only about $100 million of institutional philanthropy in Indian country today as a whole. And so what that would radically do is, one, it does increase a total amount, but what it does is it changes the power structure, because all of a sudden the Indigenous people who have lived experience in doing this work in the ground become the biggest funder of Indigenous people, and who has the moral authority to set agendas, to who's setting the dinner table. And all of a sudden, these philanthropic entities that have a deep history and a direct relationship to the exploitation of Indigenous people and Indigenous people's lands, for us to accomplish our goal, it means that they're giving up decision-making power and resources into the hands of more impacted people. And so the distance between the money and what impact needs to happen is shortening and shortening over time. And so that's a big structural change. It means people have to give up power. It means people have to give up money. It means that people have to actually do the work of recognizing power and privilege in these power dynamics that we exist in today. Because if we don't deal with that core issue, what we're going to end up doing is perpetuating the problem, the very problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, well, that's so helpful, Nick. And again, it's just so important to see that coming together of not just the amount of resources, but also who controls those resources, where they get directed, and who has voice. I mean, participation and voice in and of itself matter and are so central to what you do. And I hope that this is a moment where philanthropy, it takes note and is willing to pivot and adjust and give up some of that power. But as we know, it's no easy task.
And I will say this, Indian Collective is an organization who's about 19, 20 months old, something like that, and in a pretty short period of time, we have over 30 philanthropic partners and have raised over $25 million to launch this concept and idea. And so the cool thing is I've been actually pleasantly surprised about the number of people with resources who are willing to have this conversation, who actually realize, hey, armchair philanthropy is so far away from the problem, it's dangerous for them to be creating decisions about where those resources should go. We need to get our resources closer to the people with the solutions, who are on the ground. And so, at the same time, I've been sort of, putting our philanthropic partners to task. We have many philanthropic partners that people would be surprised who stepped up. Foundations like the JPB Foundation, Tamalpais Trust, the Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Cerdna Foundation, Doris Duke. I could go on, but we had, there's a lot of partners. And the cool thing is, I would say that the vast majority of our partners, they get our entire theory of change. Then they get that it's actually driven by us, like in our own terms. And I think that that's huge, because if we're as an organization going to invest into the self-determination of Indigenous people wherever we go, then our organization has to be a reflection of that. And that's why we only invest into Indigenous-led efforts. Indian Collective itself is 100% Indigenous-led organization. So our 21 staff, our 8-member board, 100% Indigenous-led. And that's important because a lot of times, Indigenous people have been left out of decision-making and left out of those structures. And so we're being very intentional about how we're trying to do that work. And so it's an uphill battle, because there still is partners that we have too, that are in our portfolio that we are partnered with, who still think that they can control what we do or influence what we do. And so, I always say, like, our work is not really like fundraising per se, like raising the money as a result of having brought folks along, right? And so the behind the scenes work that we do is really challenging. And I could list off a lot of people, influencers in the field of philanthropy, who are like, heck yes, I'm down with what they're doing. And I can list off a bunch of other people who this has made them extremely uncomfortable. And at the reality, at the end of the day, like, with the amount of injustices that are facing Indigenous people need to be uncomfortable. I mean, that's part of why NDN is sort of kind of in your face, like saying things of what they exactly are,
Yeah. Thank you. And Nick, when we just turning a little bit to the immediate effects of this pandemic, I mean, one of the things that's become clear is how much more devastating it has been for some people and some communities than others, and bringing into stark view the deep inequities that existed long before COVID-19. Tell us a little bit how the pandemic is affecting Indigenous communities in particular.
Well, as example, one of our, I was just on the phone with our relatives down in the Navajo and Dene territory this morning. I've been on the phone with them probably every other day down there. And we're funding, several organizations down there. You got a community down there that before the pandemic, 65,000 people in the Navajo Nation didn't have any power at all. Zero. No power, no electricity. So of course, if they don't have electricity, they're definitely not having broadband.
Right.
They're not having access to the internet. And these are these are like, shocks and astonishments that people don't realize, or that you have, the Indian health services that exist all throughout Indian country, who some who have no ICU beds, meaning like if there start to be an outbreak in those communities, there's literally no beds. They just use helicopter services to transport people. And it's really similar to that, like here on Pine Ridge. And so, you have, those impacts. You have education that has purely stopped for people who don't have access to technology. We have a lot of like another way that it impacts Indigenous people. If you imagine our language and our culture, our ceremonies are such the cornerstone of part of who we are. And one of the realities is, even here on Pine Ridge, the average age of a Lakota speaker is about 72 years old. Mm-hmm. And this disease specifically impacts elderly. And so all of a sudden, when you look at that, we're already, before this pandemic, we're only about 12 to 15 years away from losing our language. Well, all of a sudden, you're having a percentage of your elders being killed off by a global pandemic. The very livelihood of our language and our culture is at stake too. And so these are all unique ways, that we are impacted. These are all ways that we are completely impacted by COVID-19. I think that in our rural places, in some ways, that our rural areas give us away from the inner cities, right, and away from these other places. But the isolation is dangerous too, because all of a sudden you have folks that, you have a higher rate of diabetes in Indian country who need insulin. And now you have these, because of social distancing, you have people that are locking down entire reservations like they did here on Pine Ridge. And then you have people who can't have their insulin delivered to them. And so, and go through dialysis. So there's all of these like compounded challenges that exist that come from generational poverty, generational underinvestment, and active erasure of Indigenous people. So those are all things that are like directly impacting Native people today. And I'm sure I didn't even list all of them. I just list a few of them,
And are you, have you pivoted and seen other leaders pivot over the last just several weeks in terms of responding? And what are some of the ways, that most effective ways you've seen people try and respond given some of the outsized vulnerability?
So like how we've pivoted here at Indian Collective, we were already in this process of building this $50 million fund and building all the infrastructure and the team to support that fund for those resources to be moved throughout Indigenous communities. But we recognized, hey, one, we're not a relief organization. So like, let's not pretend to be something that we're not. Let's stay in our lane and actually deepen our practice in that. And so we made a decision to, one, and I think that in many communities, these decisions are good, but we made a decision at Indian Collective to, to continue our efforts, right? To continue our efforts in our Indian Changemakers Fellowship, in our community renewable energy grants, in our other grant making programs, in our activist and organizing work, but at the same time launch a COVID response fund. And we made a decision to, instead of just doing a GoFundMe, let's actually do the model that we have, which is lean on, philanthropic institutions and influencers, and set a big goal. And so we set a goal of raising a $10 million COVID response fund, which is what we thought that would be enough to make a substantial, influence and impact on Indigenous communities. And so we pivoted that way. We've raised about $4 million so far. We still have $6 million to raise. So if there's any listeners out there, my shameless pitch on behalf of Indian country is we are actively fighting this thing, and we're actively building up these communities, and we're moving money to Native communities and Native leaders on a weekly basis. I think that that of the $4 million that we raised, we've already moved over 2 million of that to Native communities as of today. And we're just, as money comes in, we move it straight out. And we also are creating some strategies with leaders too. And because I think that one of the things that is happening in this time is you have these amazing leaders that are in charge of, entire tribal nations or entire communities, but who also hit sort of a ceiling where they get froze. And I think that there's something that's happening in leadership, not only in Indigenous communities, but around the world, where we need to be reaching out to each other and helping each other get unstuck, because the leaders of the world can't afford to be stuck in these moments. And so I think in addition to our funding, there's a lot of people in our team who've been doing that with each other. And I think that when you look at, the mixture of ways that tribal communities are responding, right? If you look at the massive, ways that tribal communities are responding, people are doing mutual aid, food, water, shelter, collective mutual aid led by grassroots organizations. You have tribal emergency management departments who are implementing emergency management plans to increase ICU beds, to get increased PPE, to look at the impacts of the economics, and our job as an organization, as sort of a movement infrastructure organization, is to support that infrastructure. And one last thing that I feel like that we've been doing, a really good job of too, is uplifting our stories, and the storytelling of what's happening in Indian country, and building a media platform like we are at Indian Collective to tell those stories, and reaching out to different media outlets, and telling those raw, authentic stories has been a really important part of this work too. It's a fundamental kind of part of Indian Collective, because we want people to see us for who we are and the innovative solutions that we're creating. So
Nick, in addition to the funding, both for the immediate fund and this broader effort to marshal, more philanthropic resources into American Indian land, what is it that you need most right now to be successful? I mean, it sounds like part of it through this storytelling is you need more people to be willing and open to see the world differently and to understand their own role in perpetuating structural racism, deep inequality, but and that's no easy task, but it sounds like it's starting to happen. But what else? We've got only 2 minutes left, but maybe leave us with a kind of here's what we need, or one of the things we need most.
So yeah, I think one of the things that we need most is we need to not be forgotten at this time. I mean, Indigenous people were here before there was a country. In the height of a pandemic, it's easy to invisibilize the people that were here first. So that's one thing. Two, resources need to be moved into our communities. We don't have tax bases. We don't have, many of these things that other communities have. And so investing, and you can go to indiancollective.org. You can donate onto our webpage there. Also stay informed. There's actually a really awesome town hall happening tonight. And we're partnering, we're co-hosting and have partnered with an organization called Illuminative, Indian Country Today, and Taboo. And we'll have, a lot of folks on there tonight, including Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland, America's first Indigenous women congresswoman. And we're going to be talking about the complexities and everything that's happening. And so check out that town hall. You can find it out online. It's on the Illuminated channel, and it'll be streaming live on, I think, Taboo's Facebook. and there'll be some celebrities on there too to help attract attention too. And so sharing these stories and inviting people to understand the complexities of the issues that we face are extremely important as part of that. So donate, don't forget about us. Ask in your local communities. How are people supporting Indigenous people in your local communities? Because no matter where you are in this country, there's Indigenous people that are from there and have land from there. And so having that be not an afterthought is one of the biggest things to do.
Wonderful. Well, Nick, I think I speak for everyone who's listening in just to say we're honored to talk to you and hear from you, and just so thankful for the work that you are leading. It's as important as ever, and yeah, we deeply appreciate it. We're certainly thrilled to have you part of the Ashoka community, and I always feel like we learn and step away from a conversation with you with a better understanding of the world. So much appreciated. I wish we could have gotten to some questions from other folks who listened in, but I think in the chat there's some of these links where you can find more information. And yeah, thank you all for spending a half hour with us. It goes by really quickly, as you can tell. And Nick, we'll talk hopefully before too long.
Sounds great. Just one real last thing is just that Indian Collective truly is a collective of a lot of different Indigenous people, a different lived experience, and I'm honored to be a part of that group of people and helping lead it. And so all the things that you see happening, behind every leader, there is a whole bunch of other leaders that are uplifting that work and making it really happen. And so, just wanted to make sure that as we think about, we think about supporting whole organizations and lifting up several voices as part of this work throughout Indian country. So it's an honor to be here with each and every one of you. And yeah, we will talk again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for leaving us with that, Nick. Take care, everyone. Talk to you soon.
All right, take care.